what's going on out there, guys? So today we want to talk about kind of a concept of what we call reserves or training, and I want to think on the gross scale. It's kind of something I've just been thinking about the last few days, or just the last few books that I've read, but also kind of given the geopolitical climate that we're in right now. Obviously, kind of the resurgence of Russia, China. There's a lot of people talking, the next big war, this or that. I'm not really going to get into any of that because I think it's kind of dumb. But something I kind of wanted to discuss, because I think a lot of people don't really understand it, and it plays a huge role in a lot of the major conflicts that we know in modern history. And so when we're talking about reserves, we're talking about our strategic reserves, we're talking about the reserve program and what it actually does for armies. So we kind of have the same situation. We have the same setup in America right now. Obviously, we're an all-volunteer force. But if you look, we have a large amount of active duty members, whatever branch of service you want to talk about, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, that sort of stuff. But we also have a huge reserve component. The Marine Corps has the Marine Corps Reserve. The Army has the Army Reserve. There's the Naval Reserve. We also have the Army National Guard, which serves kind of a dual role in some of that. But what those things actually mean in our large-scale global and strategic concerns. And so if we go back, the primary period where we talk about this sort of reserve structure is going to be the 18th and 19th centuries. So we talk about, kind of the prelude to the Napoleonic Wars and that sort of stuff, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, that sort of time frame, and before that, with the emergence of Prussia and things like that under Frederick the Great. And so what we're talking is armies that have a professional army, i.e. a conscript professional, a full-time trained standing army, but then also a reserve setup, and what that means. So what that is all of the males within a certain age bracket and within a certain allowable health and that sort of standpoint are required to undergo a certain amount of training annually and for a certain amount of time. I don't have all the stats for all the countries. It's different for everybody. But essentially, the reason for that is if you think about getting into a large-scale war, you cannot afford as a country to have millions of people constantly on active duty. We have over 1 million right now between active and reserve, but if you talk about a full mobilization, in World War II, I think at the height of World War II, America had, I've seen it as 14, I've seen it as 16 million people total. Probably not at any one time, obviously, but in totality, that many people. You cannot sustain that many people being on the active duty payroll indefinitely or forever for that standpoint. So what you have are people who undergo essentially basic training and then required annual training, monthly training, whatever it may be. It's different from country to country and era to era. But now, what that gives you is, while yes, they're not probably quite as prepared and they're not stationed in places to be immediately useful, but when you do your full call-up, when you call in the reserves at the start of a conflict, now what you have is, let's say you have 1 million people on active duty total, and you have 3 million reserves, kind of a common sort of subset. Now, within several weeks or a few months, you can go from about 1 million to, let's say, that 3 or 4 million trained and decently prepared fighting men, soldiers, whatever. Whereas if you didn't have this reserve capability, now you're talking about having to not only train these people and transport them and equip them, but now you're talking about having to call them up. You have to go through the process of, what we call drafting here, just conscription. So you have to find out who they are, you have to notify them, they have to report, they have to be transported to wherever they're going to train, then they have to do the training, then they have to be transported to a unit, and then, they're reasonably prepared to do things, as far as the military needs. And why that is, it's obviously just super important, because if we take what we have today. So obviously I was in the Marine Corps, so I'm going to speak just with what I have the most experience on. The Army is very similar, slightly lower time frames. But in the Marine Corps, from the moment a person ships from MEPS to the depot, whether San Diego or Paris Island, for recruit training, which I think was boot camp, that's 13 weeks. You have 1 week in receiving, and you have 12 weeks of training. So you have 13 weeks where the person is gone just for boot camp. Then the way it sits now, you get 10 days of leave, and then you go to, so we're talking about combat arms, so we're talking about in the infantry, then you go to ITB, Infantry Training Battalion. And so that's about 8 weeks or 9 weeks. It kind of depends, because when I was in, they were kind of so full up that a lot of people ended up getting there and not getting picked up right away. So they'd have to sit around for a week or a couple weeks or a few weeks before they got picked up to a training company. Luckily, I didn't have that. I got there, got picked up in the first training company, so I got to go. So now, once they complete that, so we figure, let's call it 8 weeks, about 2 months. So you have more than 3 full months where a person is in boot camp. You have 2, or more than likely, more than slightly over 2 full months where a person is in infantry training. So let's call it 6 months. That's a very fair assessment of how long it takes to take somebody from day one to be done with infantry school. So this is a person who is just extremely basically trained. Anybody who's been in the military, any branch, any job knows when you get to your unit, you still don't really know shit about shit. You know the basics of weapons handling. If you're a decent, decent Marine, decent soldier, you know a lot of the basics of tactical movements and things like that, but you don't really know shit. So now when you get to the unit, that's when your real preparation, your real training is going to take place. But imagine this in a wartime footing. All right, let's say war is declared today, and we need X amount of millions of people, right? With no reserve system in place, we now have to call up all of these people and start them training. Imagine you even could get 5 million people in today in boot camp, which you obviously could not. It would be a minimum of 6 months before you start spitting out trained, basically trained infantry personnel to be able to do this job. And that's a huge amount of time. And so when we look at that, this has played a humongous role in the major conflicts of the 20th century. So if we look at World War I, for example, it happened, the armies of Europe were more prepared because of their recent experience in the Franco-Prussian War and then the Napoleonic Wars before that. But when America declared war in April 6th of 1917, I believe, we did not actually make our first major contribution as far as an American-led action until around March and May, so we call it the spring of 1918, kind of depending. Now, Americans were filtering in. They were putting British units, French units to gain experience, but Pershing was very adamant about not using Americans piecemeal, which I think is a very good decision, and it worked out well. So you figure it took a full year. Right? Now, a lot of people look at that and see as, somehow that we were taking our time. But imagine at the time America had something like, in the low 6 digits as far as total personnel. So you have to take all these people. I think America drafted approximately 4 million people in World War II, 4 to 5 million, I think was the last I've heard or read. So you have to take all of these people. Again, you have to get them to training. You have to train them. And then also within this context, now you have to get them to Europe, which by boat, somewhere around 2 weeks. Maybe it was slower in World War I versus World War II. We say it's about 2 weeks trip from the eastern seaboard to Britain, and then obviously to France from there. So it takes 2 weeks to get them there, but now obviously you can't just take all of these people all at once. You have to wait for the ships to come back, pick up the next load of people. So that's a month trip as it goes. So you can see why it takes this long. Now by the end of World War I, we had we had more than 2 million men in France, which is a humongous undertaking. I think they said about 10,000 people per day, starting the spring or the summer of 1918. 10,000 Americans per day were arriving. But that's why it takes so long to build up the force and why it's such a big deal when we do it. Now, if we fast forward, 25 years or so to World War II. So obviously, people are very roughly familiar with, kind of the start of World War II in Europe, 39, 40, 41, 42. And we know by the end of World War II that Germany, and for the most part, Russia and the Soviet Union as well, were kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel as far as personnel. And one obviously has to do with casualties. The Germans were relying almost, a very large scale on their Volksgrenadier elements, which were very lightly trained, recently civilians, that sort of stuff. But a lot of it also has to do with, if you look at the Treaty of Versailles, as much as I don't agree with a lot of it that took place, one thing that they did that actually had a very big effect on the Germans' ability to wage war was they took away the Germans' right to have their reserves, or their reserve army. So where typically you would have, they were allowed to have a 100,000 man standing army, where typically you'd have the 100,000 man standing army, and then you'd have 4, 5, 10 times that many people who were trained reservists. Now you don't have any of that. And this came to a head in 1942. In 1942, I think the first time it kind of got brought forward, I think Germany was at somewhere of a 280,000 man deficit on training and recruiting, because their 18-year-old and 19-year-old recruits, that should have been available for 1942 had already been called up and trained and were now filtered into units as of 1941 and early 1942. So they're starting to go through all these pangs of just not having the proper numbers of men. And obviously you still have to train them. People think of a global war, well, we just plug them in there. Well, they don't do you any good, and they'll cost you they'll cost you a lot of casualties, but also it takes money and time and manpower and various things to get them places. So you can't just waste them frivolously, especially if you don't have humongous reserves. And so this was absolutely critical on the Eastern Front, because when this first came about was as the Germans were prepping for summer of 1942, Fall Blau or Case Blue, which was obviously the German assault into the Caucasus, and then Stalingrad and things like that around the Volga River. And so at a time when they were now taking a lot of casualties, and obviously around Stalingrad they're about to take an awful lot of casualties, they don't have the people to replace them. So they're running a deficit not only because of casualties, but also the lack of trained reserves and of having to train people. So I just wrote down a couple of, key points with what this means when we're talking about setting up the reserves. So obviously this takes into account conscription. Obviously in America right now, we're an all-volunteer force, which I think is good. But historically, this is a conscription. A lot of European countries, Israel, for example, still requires mandatory, I think they're 3-year stints. And Israel's probably the best example of how this works kind of historically, but in the modern realm. So when they've been invaded, Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, things like that, they have people that go to the synagogues, they ride bikes around, and they serve everybody their call-up notices, and they have depots they report to, and they essentially go right into their unit and then where they're going to go to. And that's kind of historically how that's worked. But this has to do a lot with population size. So if you have a very large population, so I'm just going to throw out examples that aren't actually real, but look at China, for example. People throw out, well, China has such a vast manpower reserve, whoever we're going to get in war with them, yada, yada, yada. Well, one, you could never feed or clothe or equip the sheer amount of people that China could technically, conscript. But one thing that you can do is you can have a fairly large active force, and then you can have a humongous, relatively trained reserve force. So in the event of an all-out call-up, of the reserves, now you can take, you can sort of, save on resources and then make this massive call-up and have more total force in the end. And then kind of takes into account time requirements and cost requirements. So time, i.e., what we're talking about with how long it takes to train somebody. It takes somebody from a no experience, worked in a gas station, and then all of a sudden now he's considered a basically trained infantryman. Like how long that takes. So like I said, 6 months is the bare minimum. Let's call it a year is probably more accurate, but we'll say 6 months to a year with that. So you're trying to save the time, and then the cost requirements. So the cost in both casualties, lives lost, that sort of stuff. But also, let's say you have people who are not particularly well trained, and now you have to give them things like trucks or tanks or planes or artillery pieces, things that require a certain level of skill, obviously some of them a great level of skill, to operate. So now, one, they're not going to be very effective with it, but the chances that they break it, crash it, take it into combat, don't know how to use it, so they get killed or destroyed or knocked out, that goes up. So these things cost you more and more money. And it's something we actually, we talk about with the German Luftwaffe and their fighter corps in World War II. They had some of the absolute best individual pilots. They never really settled on a decent training approach to bring up, the training of their newer pilots, like the Americans and like the British did. And so what you look at is where the Germans never really had the shortage of fighters that it gets made out to be. I mean, yes, they had lower numbers than the Americans and the British counterparts in totality, but it wasn't a lack of actual machines that held them back. One, it was a lack of aviation fuel, especially towards the end, so they couldn't receive a lot of training, and they had to do somewhat limited mission sorties. But also, what you have now is the German Luftwaffe was very top-heavy. So the top 1% of their pilots were just the fucking best that you could possibly find anywhere. Everybody else were just 7 steps below that as far as their training and their skill. So they took these massive amounts of casualties against Americans and British who, not to sell us short, we rotated out our pilots to do training stuff, so our best pilots more than likely could have been as good, but they just weren't because they got rotated out to train more. So our average pilot was much better trained than the German average pilot. And this was huge. I mean, this is the thing that absolutely cost them the air war in the West. And if you know anything about the West, the German, the Reichswehr, they They lost approximately, I think it was 3.94, so about 4 times as many planes in the West versus the East. So this had just an absolutely dramatic effect on how the war itself played out. And so then over here I put, where these matter is not so much the tactical level, you could say the training level of a person absolutely does play in. But this is when we're talking Armies at the strategic or maybe even the operational level. So the ability to have a strategic reserve. So at this moment, and again I'm making up numbers, a person can go, hey, now we have a major war with Canada, we have to do a full call-up, bam, we have 4 million people that we can call up right now. Right? Versus being in the position of, okay, well we have 100,000 men, how are we going to get 4 million people trained into action? It's going to take us a year or 18 months to do that. And that's a very big deal. And so I want to keep it pretty simple with that. I probably ran sort of long on this like I always do, but I kind of wanted to bring this up just because it's something I don't think people think very much about or they don't know a lot about. And it's played absolutely humongous roles in the major wars of the 20th century, but also the 19th century, the 18th century as well. It was just the ability, like how do you, without having a full-time professional army, if we think all the way back to the Romans had a full-time professional army. It was somewhat small, but the only way a person can do that is, one, you have to have a huge slave population, which they did. You have to conquer people and take all their shit, which they did. And then you basically have to set up new colonies, new areas where you're going to then essentially conscript or entice people from those areas to fill the legion, which is what they did. They did it in Iberia, Spain, Portugal, Gaul, that sort of stuff. They did it with Germanic legions and that sort of stuff. So they're basically taking, they're not really Romans per se, they're taking people from conquered territories and enticing them to volunteer for an all-professional military for a service of 25 years or so with that. But again, remember guys, only the hits count and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.